Hello, everyone. I want to wish you a happy Easter season because we are now on the second Sunday of Easter, because it's not just one day, it is a whole season of remembering the stories of God restoring life, starting with restoring Jesus's life, but then restoring our lives. And so that is what I want to start with today is happy Easter season. And hopefully, you are thinking about the ways that God is bringing things back to life for you. It's also a time in spring when things spring back to life. So it's a good season to think about what that means. Tonight's stream storytelling is a combination of the storytelling that I shared on Easter Sunday with the Well congregation dinner in person and what we talked about tonight at our community dinner. So there's two stories. It has two parts, but they're short, but so powerful, so impactful for how we look at what it means to believe in resurrection. So I just want to start by saying, a lot of things can seem impossible or incredible and still happen in 3 days. Here's a few examples. Really simple. Did you know in order to get croissants, we actually need 3 days? You need a day to mix the dough, a day to let it rise and incorporate the butter, and then a day to shape it and bake it. If you don't take 3 days making croissants, you don't have croissants. You have some other kind of bread, but you don't have croissants. So 3 days. Also, 72 hours of sleep deprivation, 3 full days of not sleeping, can cause major cognitive deficits and hallucinations. There was a study done with 12 astronauts who were assigned to isolation for 72 hours or sleep deprivation for 72 hours. And the group that had to stay awake for 3 days, their heart rates went up, they had a higher negative mood, they had all kinds of just dysfunction in being able to do normal tasks because they weren't rested. 3 days, a lot can happen in your ability to not function in a healthy, normal way if you miss sleep for 3 days. Or how about this one? There is an app called the Gudok Cam app. And what it does is gives you 24 pictures like an old roll of film. So if you're young and you've never had to take a roll of film and have it developed and wait for the pictures, this app simulates that experience for you. Those of us who grew up waiting for pictures to be developed don't have the experience and the luxury that children of our this generation do of just snapping a picture and it's immediately there for them. So if you want if you want to feel like what it's like to wait for a picture for 3 days, the anticipation of getting it back, you can use the Gudok app and it will actually take the pictures and then make you wait. You won't get to see them for 3 days, and it will give it that vintage 1985 kind of look. So kind of a strange experiment, but if you want that experience, it's available. How about this? There's a man in Philadelphia who has an apartment and it's filled with 350 plants. Right there, I'm just thinking that's incredible. How do you fit 350 plants in a small Philadelphia apartment? But on top of that, he reports to Spruce Magazine that it takes him 3 days to water all 350 plants. And it just makes me wonder, like, what does this guy do for a living that he can spend 3 days a week watering plants? So anyway, so there's a 3-day one for you. My favorite, one of my favorites is this one. Jordan Trofe ran 3 marathons in 3 days in 3 different cities. Now, for many of us, that just seems impossible because the first thought is there's no way my body can do that. That would be me raising my hand. And I actually am a runner. I love to run. I've been running since I was 16 years old. I'm not fast. I've done about 15 half marathons. So I'm a half marathoner. But to think of doing 1 full marathon every day for 3 days and having to travel to a new city to get to it, that seems absolutely impossible to me. But this young man, Jordan, ran the Baltimore Marathon, the Chicago Marathon, and the Boston Marathon in 3 days. Seems impossible, but he did it. Lastly, a trip to the moon. 3 days. It takes 3 days to travel the 240,000 miles to get to the moon. Something that 80 years ago seemed like a dream, a fantasy, impossible. But in 3 days, middle of the 20th century, we sent astronauts to the moon. So a lot can happen in 3 days. A lot of things, good or bad, that we thought weren't possible can happen in 3 days. And for Easter, we celebrate an impossible, incredible Easter story. And I wonder often, I try to imagine after Jesus died, how I would have felt if I had been among his friends and followers in the hours and the day after. I can imagine this weight of personal loss and spiritual and political loss bearing down on them. They had believed that he would change everything. He changed their hope. They believed he was changing their circumstances in the Roman Empire. They believed he was making a difference in the oppression that they were experiencing. But now he was most certainly dead. And all the things that they had signed up to be a part of, they felt dead too. And I think about that Saturday. I think about those emotions and more now after living through the weekend that my father died. I was numb. I remember that. I remember reality feeling so blurry, but there was also a pain and a deep, deep hole in my heart. And even though it was filling with grief, that grief felt empty. It was just this hole taking up space. So I feel like I have a better understanding of the sense of loss they felt. And I imagine they all gathered together for comfort, for food, and to share tears, because that's what we do, right? We go to one person's house, people bring food, we eat, we talk, we relive all the moments with that person, the memories, the funny things we loved, the wonderful things, and maybe not so wonderful things, but we go through all of those things. And we have to tell those stories. We get our sustenance from being together and from sharing in that together. I think it's what helps us process the empty chair in the room. Or maybe it's just what helps us just be distracted until we actually can process. So all Friday evening, all Saturday, and early on into Sunday morning, this is where they were and who they were with. Jesus' friends and followers were all together holding each other. And as is custom on Sunday morning, the women of the group took spices and oils that they had prepared to the cave, to the tomb where Jesus had been laid to rest. These supplies would have helped with decomposition and odors, and also just honored the body, honored the life. And I'm guessing as they walked to the tomb, they all were thinking, why? Why him? Why now? And before the women ever understood what had happened and why, they went to this place of their deepest grief. They didn't ignore it. They turned and walked toward where he was buried. They faced that grief. And they went inside the tomb, even though they had questions that outweighed all their answers. They didn't run away when unknown visitors in blinding white clothes suddenly showed up, even though they were definitely afraid. They remembered that Jesus had said something about coming back to life, but they had dismissed that as another one of his parables or something they'd figure out later. But now they were remembering it. And I'm not sure they immediately accepted what the messenger said, but they definitely did not reject it. And the story says that they ran back to the group that was huddled together in a neighbor's house, and they shared what they had seen and what they had heard. They were somewhere, these women were somewhere in between the terrible reality of losing Jesus and the impossibility that God had done something they never thought possible. They weren't afraid to talk about what they'd experienced, even though they did not understand it. And because women experienced a lower standing in that culture than men, no one believed what they saw. They just dismissed it. And I imagine all the days that they walked along with Jesus, sharing meals, watching him love and heal people, and even the last few devastating days, they all started to give them this new picture of who their friend actually was. And no amount of dismissal from a group of men was going to discourage them from living into the remarkable tension of what they knew and what they were beginning to understand. So, when we say the words, Jesus is risen, where do you find yourself in that statement? on the journey from the house where everyone is grieving to the tomb where impossible news was shared and then delivered back to the house where everyone was still grieving and didn't believe what had been reported, where do you find yourself in that spectrum? I ask because I think it's important to remember that in the days after this one very impossible day, those who passed down the personal accounts of this era, those who wrote Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, they all agree that everyone who was in that house, whether they were running to the grave, running back to report, doubting, believing, still struggling, hoping, all of them saw Jesus. He showed up for them regardless of how much they understood or believed. Let me just say that one more time. If you don't hear anything else today, hear this. Wherever they were in the house, running to the grave, running back to report, doubting, believing, still struggling, hoping, all of them, every one of them saw Jesus. He showed up for them regardless of how much they understood or believed.